I see you. I see.
I bring it down like.
I see you. I see.
I bring it down like.
Lofi Poli Sci, how we doing out there? Dr. P right here talking that famous question. What's going on in our world today? And if you're out there hearing our voice, then connect to us, people, for all your local Lo-Fi updates. Oh, and we got them for you today. But we're all connect to us, people. Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, we're all over the place. Now, today we're talking about just a couple of things, a couple of headlines out there in the verse right now. Those being the ICJ just ruled against Israel's occupation of Palestinian lands, and that President Joe Biden has eventually dropped out of the re-election campaign for President of the United States of America. Firstly, let's go to Israel and the United Nations, because this really isn't all that different from what happened with the United Nations Security Council just a few months ago. You know, if you remember, the UN Security Council, the only body/institution in the United Nations that has any kind of binding power over all UN members? Yeah, that UN Security Council. They voted unanimously to impose a ceasefire order on Israel and Hamas, which that binding resolution has the force of international law. And as all of you are all aware, the war is still going on, and both sides are still fighting, meaning no one listened to the UN Security Council's binding resolution that ordered a ceasefire to take place. And nothing was done to anyone for violating that binding resolution. Doesn't seem that binding now, does it? Now, fast forward to today. Just this past week, the United Nations Court, the International Court of Justice, aka the ICJ, ruled on a court case brought before them that the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip were all illegal and violated international law about seizing new territories by force. And the court ordered Israel to give back the lands right away. Now, while the UN Security Council can issue binding resolutions, which no one listens to, obviously, the ICJ cannot issue binding resolutions, which means, of course, no one's going to listen to them. This all means nothing as far as immediate actions to be taken. The ICJ and the UN are not going to militarily stop Israel, nor are they going to use any international military force to go into Israel and force them to give back the lands to the Palestinian people. That's not going to happen. So then, what does this mean? ? Well, if you hear people talking, they're saying things like, it'll add to already mounting international pressure on Israel to comply, or it may affect some trade deals, and this, and that, and that, and this, but the real question remains, is any of that enough to force Israel to comply with either of the rulings? And the answer is no, absolutely not. And what's more, so long as the United States is backing Israel doesn't need the international community's support. The U.S. is the largest economy in the world, and trading with the U.S. alone is enough to sustain the Israeli economy. Now, that said, next question. Does the United States' constant support for Israel change depending on who the next president is? ? Maybe. So let's talk about it. As of Sunday, July 21st, today for me, yesterday for you, President Joe Biden has announced he is stopping his campaign for re-election for the President of the United States of America and is officially endorsing his Vice President Kamala Harris. Now, if Kamala Harris does in fact get the entire Democratic Party support and nomination for the presidency, which as of Sunday, we do not know if that will happen. It hasn't been announced. But the assumption kind of is it's going to happen. But then the election campaign is former President Donald Trump versus current Vice President Kamala Harris. And yes, if you didn't already pick up on it, this will make Donald Trump the first and as of yet only presidential candidate to run against two different female candidates for the presidency of the United States of America in the general election. The first one being former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. But if Kamala Harris and Donald Trump end up in the general election against each other, could support of Israel play a role in the election outcome? That's what we're thinking about as far as our two stories today. And in the case, between the two parties and these two candidates, I don't think so. At least not in a clear way that some people may think. Kamala Harris will be able to take this chance to heal the wounds in the Democratic Party, so to speak, over President Biden's support for Israel, and therefore she may gain votes back by doing this. And if Donald Trump supports Israel, as he always did in the past, he even changed the U.S. embassy to that in Jerusalem, then he could gain votes that way, or at least not lose votes. So you see, in this case, with these two things likely being true, it seems as though they'll just kind of cancel each other out, and therefore no one gains or loses from supporting or not supporting Israel in the Gaza war. Plus, most voters vote based on partisanship and domestic issues. Now, if Donald Trump gets elected, it's likely he'll continue to support Israel. Period. So in this case, the UN's ruling in the future, even more mounting international pressure against Israel, likely isn't going to stop Israel from doing anything, at least not in the short run. That's if Donald Trump gets elected and his support for Israel continues, which is all likely. Now, if Kamala Harris gets elected, would her administration stop supporting Israel and therefore join in with mounting international pressure to have Israel stop its occupation as just ruled by the International Court of Justice? And I think the answer is not likely enough to actually cause Israel to stop. No. It's highly unlikely that any U.S. president would cut ties with Israel, so much so that they would be forced to fall in line with international law. The U.S. and other Western allies of Israel have way too much to lose from Israel being upset with them over this issue. The West could lose its only ally in the Middle East. And that is not something, strategically speaking, the West wants to do. So, the United Nations Court, called the ICJ, ruled that Israel must end its occupation in Palestinian lands. Israel will likely not comply with this ruling. No one will do anything about it, and President Joe Biden of the United States is no longer running for president, and it's likely that Vice President Kamala Harris will run against Donald Trump in the general election, and it's unlikely that either of the candidates would isolate Israel enough to cause them to fall in line with the ICJ ruling, so the UN's ruling is all talk, and no one's going to do anything to enforce it, and therefore, Israel's not going to do it. And the US presidential election will likely have no bearing on the outcome. Now, who's going to win the U.S. presidential election between current Vice President Kamala Harris and former U.S. President Donald Trump? Well, you'll just have to come back to find out more next time. Love you, Lofi. And this, just a snap of what's going on in the world today.
I see.
I bring it down like.
Lofi Poli Sci is more than just me. It's the we that we be. Pickering, signing off.